The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. Book 3, The Castle of Llyr. Chapter 9, The Luck of Roon.
"He's found her!" Taran shouted as the companions pressed around the frantic crow. "Where has Mag taken her?"
"Allah!"
croaked Ka.
"Allah!"
"The river!" Taran exclaimed. "How far is it?"
"Close! Close!"
replied Ka.
"No question of going back to Dinah's rednet now!" cried Prince Rhun. "Mag's in our hands! We'll have the princess back again in no time at all!"
If Lion doesn't have us in her paws first,
muttered Fluider. He turned to Taran.
Can Ka bear word to the master of horse? I don't mind telling you, I should feel safer with a few warriors behind me.
"We dare not lose time," Taran answered. "Prince Rhun is right. We must act now or Mag will slip through our fingers. Quickly, old friend," he said to Ka, urging the crow aloft. "Guide us to the Allah." They set off in haste. The crow fluttered from one tree to the next, jabbering impatiently until the companions drew closer. Then, launching himself once more into the air, Ka streaked onward in the direction he wished them to follow. The crow, Taran knew, was doing his best to bring them as quickly as possible out of the hills, but many times the forest and underbrush formed such a tangled barrier the companions were forced to draw their swords and hack their way through. Their path did not ease until well past midday, when Ka led them across a low, rolling plain which soon fell into pebbly ravines. The turf was short and stubbly, with many splotches of bare ground where chalk-white boulders were strewn like giant hailstones.
"With all of Rudlam's warriors, combing Mona!"
Fluider cried angrily as they began the descent toward the river.
"How has that spider managed to escape us for so long?"
"Mag has been more cunning than we thought," Taran said bitterly. "I'm sure he took Eilonwy into the hills of Paris, but he must have hidden away, without moving until he knew the search had swept beyond him."
"The villain!"
Fluider snorted.
"So it must have been. While we all went tracking farther and farther away from the castle, that foul Mag waited at his ease until we'd gone so far ahead that he was behind us. No matter. We'll soon have him by the heels, and he'll pay for that trick."
Ka, circling in great loops above the companions, had grown more agitated and began a raucous croaking. Taran caught a glimpse of the Allah flashing below. Ka, in a burst of speed, flew directly toward it. With Prince Rhun gasping and puffing behind them, the companions ran down the slope. Ka, lighting on a branch, madly flapped his wings. Taran's heart sank. There was no trace of Eilonwy or Mag, and in another moment he dropped to one knee. "Fluider!" he shouted. "Quickly! Here are hoof prints! 2 horses!" He followed the trail for a few paces, then halted, puzzled. "See this?" he said to the bard and Gurgi, who had come up beside him. "The tracks follow different paths. I don't understand what could have happened. Prince Rhun," he called, "can you see anything of the steeds?" No answer came from the Prince of Mona. Taran leaped to his feet and spun about. "Rhun!" he cried, but there was no sign whatever of the prince. "He wandered off again!" Taran shouted furiously. "Feckless dolt! Where has he gone?" Calling anxiously for Rhun, the three raced on to the riverbank. Taran was about to set off alone to seek him when the Prince of Mona appeared from a stand of willows. "Hello, hello!" Rhun hurried forward, beaming delightedly. Before the relieved but angry Taran could take him to task, the prince called out, "Look at this! The amazing, really astonishing!" Prince Rhun held out his hand. In it lay Eilonwy's bauble. His heart pounding, Taran stared at the golden sphere. "Where did you find this?" "Why, over there," answered Rhun, pointing to a moss-covered rock. "While you were looking at hoof prints, I thought I might go and search somewhere else to save us time. And this is what I found." He handed the bauble to Taran, who carefully tucked it into his jacket.
"He's led us to fresh tracks," said Fluider, studying the grass. "Something fairly large and flat has been dragged along here."
He scratched his chin thoughtfully.
I wonder, a boat? Could it be? Did that sneering spider have one ready and waiting? I shouldn't be surprised if he had planned it all before Eilonwy reached Mona.
Tarn strode down the bank. I see footprints, he called. The ground is badly torn. Eilonwy must have struggled with him. Yes, right there. And there she would have dropped the bauble. In dismay, he looked at the wide, rapid-flowing Ala. You have read the signs well, Fluider, he said. Mag had a boat here. He set loose the horses and let them run as they pleased. Tarn stood a moment, watching the turbulent water, then drew his sword. Come, lend me a hand, he called to Gurgi and the bard, and ran to the willows. Dare you say, what have you in mind? Cried Rhun, as Tarn chopped hastily at the lower branches. Making a fire? That's hardly any need. We can build a raft, replied Tarn, throwing the cut branches on the ground. The river has helped Mag. Now it shall help us. The companions ripped vines from the tree trunks and lashed the cut branches together, lengthening the makeshift cords with strips torn from their own garments. Ungainly though it was, and looking more like a bundle of kindling wood, the raft was soon ready. But no sooner had Tarn began tying the last knots in the tangle of vines and rags when Gurgi shrieked in fear. Tarn leaped to his feet and spun around as Gurgi gestured wildly toward the trees farther up the riverbank. Lion had burst from the woods. The great tawny mountain cat halted for an instant, one paw raised, her tail lashing, her eyes blazing as the companions, who fell back in terror. The raft! Tarn shouted. Into the river with it! He seized one end of the clumsy craft and struggled to haul it to the water. Still yelling, Gurgi ran to aid him. Prince Rhun toiled as best he could to help. The bard had already splashed into the stream, where he stood hip deep in the current and heaved at the branches. Lion's tufted ears cupped forward, and her whiskers twitched as her glance fell on the bard. From her throat rose not a savage roar, but a bell-like, questioning cry. Eyes shining with a strange glow, she leaped forward on huge, padded paws. Purring loudly, the mountain cat made straight for the frantic bard.
Great Bellin!
Cried Fluider.
She wants me back again!
It was then that Ka, perched on a low branch, beat his wings and launched himself against Lion. Squawking and croaking at the top of his voice, the crow swooped down on the astonished beast. Lion stopped in her tracks and roared angrily. Flying at full speed, Ka passed within a hair's breadth of Lion's mighty head, striking out with his wings and pecking at her with his sharp beak. Taken by surprise, Lion fell back on her haunches and turned to face the crow. Ka veered in a tight circle and swooped again. Lion sprang into the air, claws unsheathed and slashing. Tarn cried in dismay as a cloud of feathers floated downward. But an instant later, he saw the crow still aloft and plunging again toward Lion. Dancing in front of her like a large black hornet, Ka jabbered impudently as though daring the beast to catch him, flapped his wings in her face, and sped away once more. At his next dive, which brought him so close that Lion's teeth snapped shut on one of his tail feathers, Ka seized and tweaked a curling whisker. Yowling furiously, forgetting the bard and the struggling companions, Lion raced after the crow, who flapped from the riverbank into the woods. Lion followed, and her roars echoed among the trees. With a final heave, the companions flung the raft into the river and scrambled aboard. The current snatched and spun the craft, nearly capsizing it before Tarn could thrust a pole into the water. Fluider and Gurgi fended the raft off a threatening boulder. Prince Rhun, drenched to the skin, paddled desperately with his hands. In another moment, the raft righted itself, and the companions skimmed rapidly downstream. Fluider, whose face had turned deathly pale, gave a sigh of relief.
I feared she had me for sure. Believe me, I couldn't stand another bout of harping like the last one. I hope Ka fares well,
he added anxiously. Ka will find us again, Tarn assured him. He's clever enough to stay out of Lion's reach until he knows we're safe. If she keeps chasing him, I'm certain she'll have the worst of the battle. Fluider nodded, then turned and glanced back over his shoulder.
In a way,
he said with a note of regret in his voice.
It's the first time my music has really been, in a manner of speaking, sought after. In this case, if it weren't so dangerous, I should call it downright complimentary.
I say,
called Prince Rhun, crouching at the front of the raft.
I don't mean to complain after all the work you've done, but I think something's breaking loose.
Taran, busy steering, glanced down in alarm. The hurriedly knotted vines had begun to give way. The raft shuddered in the swift current. With the pole, Taran thrust deeply for the river bottom, seeking to bring the raft to a halt. The current bore it onward, and the branches bent and twisted as the water poured through the gaps. One of the vines parted, a branch ripped free, then another. Throwing aside the useless pole, Taran shouted for the companions to jump clear. Seizing Prince Rhun by the jacket, he sprang into the river. As the water closed over his head, Prince Rhun kicked and struggled wildly. Taran tightened his grasp on the floundering prince and fought his way to the surface. With a free hand, he clung to a boulder and gained a foothold among the shifting stones. Heaving with all his strength, he dragged Rhun ashore and flung him to the bank. Gurgi and Fluider had managed to catch hold of what remained of the raft and were hauling it into the shallows. Prince Rhun sat up and looked around.
That's the closest I've ever been to drowning,
he gasped.
I've often wondered what it was like, though now I don't think I'd care to know.
Drowning?
Said Fluider, staring at the wreckage of the craft.
Worse than that? All our labor has gone for naught.
Taran rose wearily to his feet. Most of the branches can be used. We'll cut more vines and start again. The discouraged companions turned to the task of repairing the raft, now strewn in pieces along the bank. The work went more slowly than before, for the trees grew sparser here and vines were scarce. The Prince of Mona had made his way to a clump of oysters, and Taran glimpsed him tugging away, trying to uproot them. The next instant, Rhun was no longer in sight. With a shout of alarm, Taran dropped his armload of vines and ran toward the spot, calling Rhun's name. The bard looked up.
Not again,
he cried.
If there were a field with one stone, he'd trip over it. A flam is patient, but there are limits.
Nevertheless, he hurried to join Taran, who was already kneeling among the oysters. At the spot where Rhun had been standing was a gaping hole. The Prince of Mona had vanished.